"Bring her to me," he ordered. The Mafia boss broke down when he saw her bruised and terrified. 6 armed men stood in the foyer. None of them had ever seen Vincent Calloway's face do what it was about to do. A woman stood between them, battered, barefoot, wrapped in a torn blanket someone threw over her shoulders because there was nothing else on hand. Terrified in the specific way of someone whose body had forgotten every language except fear. Vincent looked at her face beneath the bruising and the dirt. 11 seconds later, the room was empty. "Bring her to me. Everyone else, out." His voice didn't shake once, giving that order. It shattered completely the moment the door closed behind the last man leaving. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments because what happens next is going to leave you speechless. Like, share, notifications on. You are not ready for this story. Vincent Calloway was a powerful man. Powerful men in his world weren't supposed to break. Nobody in the Calloway organization had ever seen him cry. Not once. Not in 15 years of building the most feared criminal infrastructure on the eastern seaboard. Not when his father died. Not when a rival family put 3 bullets in his shoulder 2 years earlier, and he'd walked out of surgery giving orders before the anesthesia fully cleared. Everything changed the night his men brought him a woman he wasn't expecting to see again. 11 years earlier, 25-year-old Vincent had been 3 states away closing a deal that would double his father's territory. The kind of deal that mattered enough to keep him from home for 6 straight days. The call came in the middle of the night. House fire. His 17-year-old sister, Marisol, hadn't made it out. Vincent remembered almost nothing from the drive back, except the specific, suffocating weight of every mile between him and a house that no longer existed the way he'd left it. He remembered standing at the edge of scorched wreckage, remembered a fire marshal's clipped, procedural explanation of accelerant patterns and structural collapse, remembered a body too damaged to identify conclusively that the medical examiner cleared for burial anyway with a speed that, at the time, had felt like mercy rather than warning. He buried an empty casket. He grieved the way his world had already taught him grief had to look, alone, controlled, invisible. Showing weakness in his father's organization got you killed just as fast as showing disloyalty. Vincent had learned that lesson early, and he learned it permanently the week he buried his only sister and didn't let a single person outside his own locked bedroom see him cry. What came after was 15 years of the specific, cold fury of a boy who'd lost the only real family he had left and swore, standing over that empty grave, that he would never again be powerless to protect anyone. He built an empire on that promise. Territory expanded with ruthless, methodical precision. Rivals absorbed, eliminated, or brought fully under Calloway control. A name that made seasoned criminals across 5 states lower their voices out of habit, built over more than a decade. Vincent Calloway became untouchable in exactly the way the 17-year-old version of himself had once believed his sister deserved to be. Nobody in his organization knew the full weight of what her death had actually done to him. Not Marcus Delgado, his second-in-command for over a decade. Not a single soul who'd watched Vincent build an empire from the ashes of a fire that took everything he loved and turned him into someone the entire eastern seaboard feared. Tonight, his men reported an unidentified woman found wandering near the docks, disoriented, refusing to speak to anyone except demanding, with a specific, unshakable insistence that cut through her obvious exhaustion, to see Vincent Calloway directly. His irritation at the interruption lasted exactly as long as it took her to be brought into his foyer. Her hair hung matted and tangled around a face marked with bruising in various stages of healing, bare feet, scraped and bleeding along the arches. The torn blanket wrapped around her shoulders did nothing to hide the specific way her whole body trembled, the way her eyes darted toward every exit in the room, with the practiced vigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was a lie people told right before taking something else from you. Vincent looked at her face. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anything in 11 years. The room went completely silent. "Bring her to me." His voice carried none of its usual controlled authority. Something underneath it had already started to crack. Everyone else, out. Now. Marcus moved first, herding the remaining armed men toward the door, with the specific, efficient urgency of a man who'd never once heard that particular register in his boss's voice, and understood immediately that whatever was happening required privacy Vincent had never before demanded from his own house. The heavy door closed. Vincent crossed the marble floor toward her with steps that didn't feel steady the way every step he'd taken in 15 years had felt steady. Marisol. Her name came out broken, disbelieving, torn from somewhere he'd buried alongside an empty casket 11 years earlier. The woman in the blanket flinched at the sound of it, taking an instinctive step backward, her eyes searching his face with none of the recognition he was desperately hoping to find there. Vincent's knees hit the marble floor. The most feared man on the eastern seaboard, the specific controlled violence that had built an empire out of grief, collapsed completely in his own foyer, sobbing his sister's name into hands that had ordered violence without hesitation for 15 straight years and had never once shaken like this. He had buried her. He had stood over an empty grave and promised himself he would never again be powerless to protect what mattered. And now she was standing 3 feet away from him, alive, terrified, flinching at the sound of her own name, and Vincent Calloway understood with devastating, immediate clarity that everything he'd believed for 11 years had been a lie someone had constructed with enough precision to fool a boy desperate enough to believe it. Marisol stood frozen above him. She didn't recognize the terrifying, powerful man crumpled on the floor in front of her as anything resembling safety. 11 years had taught her that men who broke down in front of you were often more dangerous than the ones who stayed composed, that tears could be their own kind of manipulation, that the brother she remembered from childhood had likely died alongside every other soft, trusting piece of herself the night everything changed. She didn't move toward him. She didn't move away either. She simply stood in the specific frozen stillness of someone who'd survived 11 years by never once trusting the first version of any situation presented to her, watching the most powerful man she'd ever heard whispered about in fear sob against his own marble floor, and feeling absolutely nothing that resembled the relief she should have felt at finally being found. Marcus Delgado stood outside the closed door for 4 full minutes before he moved. A decade of reading his boss's exact moods, his exact silences, his exact thresholds for interruption had taught him precisely nothing about what was happening on the other side of that door right now. He'd witnessed Vincent Calloway negotiate at gunpoint without a single flicker of visible fear. He'd watched him take 3 bullets to the shoulder and give tactical orders before the ambulance arrived. He had never once heard the sound currently bleeding through solid mahogany. Vincent's voice, raw and broken, asking the same disbelieving questions in different order. How, when, where have you been? Who did this to you? Questions tumbling out faster than any answer could possibly keep pace with them. Marisol answered none of them coherently. Every attempt Vincent made to close the distance between them, every instinctive reach toward her shoulder or her hand, produced the same immediate, visceral flinch. Her whole body contracting inward, breath catching sharp and shallow, eyes fixed on his hands with the specific hyper-awareness of someone whose body had learned, cell by cell, that hands reaching toward her rarely meant anything good. Vincent stopped reaching. He sat back on his heels on the marble floor, putting distance between them that cost him something visible in his expression, and simply looked at her instead. The sister he remembered was 17, loud, opinionated, obsessed with a specific pop band whose posters had covered every inch of her bedroom walls. The woman in front of him flinched from sudden movement, wouldn't meet his eyes for longer than a second at a time, and carried herself with the specific compressed stillness of someone permanently braced for an attack that hadn't come yet. 11 years had built someone else entirely on top of her. Marcus finally opened the door an inch, keeping his own presence deliberately small, unthreatening. "Boss." He kept his voice low, careful. "I know someone." Discreet, no connection to us, full confidentiality. Vincent's eyes, still wet, found his second's face with something between gratitude and desperation. Get her here, tonight. Dr. Priya Anand arrived within 2 hours, a trauma specialist whose entire career had been built on the specific promise of absolute discretion. Patients whose identities never appeared in any file, whose treatment never connected back to whoever paid for it, whose survival depended entirely on people never knowing whose family she treated. Her assessment of Marisol began carefully, patiently, with none of the urgent intensity Vincent's own desperate questions had carried. She sat across from Marisol in a quiet room, keeping her voice level, unhurried. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. I'm just here to help you feel safer than you do right now. Marisol's eyes tracked every movement in the room with the same relentless vigilance she'd shown since arriving, but something in Priya's careful, unhurried patience produced a fraction less tension in her shoulders than anything Vincent's desperate reaching had managed. Priya's early notes, delivered to Vincent in the hallway afterward, carried the specific clinical weight of confirmation he'd been dreading. Everything I'm seeing is consistent with sustained, controlled captivity, not weeks, not months. This is over a decade of psychological patterns, learned helplessness cycles, hypervigilance, a specific inability to distinguish safety from another form of control. Whoever held her understood exactly how to keep someone captive without needing constant physical restraint. Vincent's jaw tightened. She's been alive this whole time. Someone made very sure you'd never think to look. Over the following days, fragments began surfacing during Marisol's sessions with Priya, not the full truth, delivered in halting pieces that came without warning, and disappeared just as quickly whenever the memory pushed too close to something she wasn't ready to hold yet. A room with no windows, a rotation of different faces who brought food but rarely spoke, the specific sound of multiple locks disengaging in sequence whenever someone entered, and the growing, horrifying realization Vincent pieced together across those fragmented sessions. His sister's death had never been an accident. Someone had deliberately staged that fire. Someone had falsified a body's identification with enough precision to fool a grieving 25-year-old and an entire medical examiner's office. Someone had held his sister captive for 11 years and had the resources and patience to maintain a lie of that magnitude indefinitely. Marcus began his own parallel investigation the same night, pulling the original fire report from 11 years earlier out of storage, cross-referencing every signature, every timestamp, every procedural step that should have raised immediate red flags and somehow never had. What he found made his stomach turn. A medical examiner's report signed off within 6 hours of the body's discovery, impossibly fast for the kind of conclusive identification the report claimed to represent. An insurance settlement processed through a chain of shell corporations that took Marcus 3 full days of careful, methodical tracing to fully map, and at the end of that chain, buried 3 layers deep in falsified paperwork and corporate fronts, designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of tracing. A name that made Marcus go completely still at his desk. He brought it to Vincent at 2 in the morning, the file open on the desk between them, his voice carrying none of its usual steady confidence. I need you to look at this before I say anything else. Vincent's eyes scanned the document, the Shell Corporation trail, the specific name at the center of 11 years of engineered lies. Elena Voss. Marcus's voice dropped lower. We've had peripheral dealings with her network for almost 8 years. Legitimate business, mostly. Nothing that ever raised a flag. Vincent's hands, still resting on the desk, went completely rigid. 8 years. His voice came out flat, devastating in its complete lack of inflection. I have been doing business, however distantly, with the person responsible for the worst day of my entire life, and I never once knew. Marcus said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say to a truth that devastating. Vincent closed the file slowly, his mind already running through 8 years of transactions, meetings, distant business connections, that suddenly demanded re-examination through an entirely different lens. Somewhere in his own organization's history, in deals he'd approved without a second thought, he'd been standing closer to his sister's captors than he ever could have imagined, and he had absolutely no idea yet how much closer that connection actually ran. Vincent's fury settled into something colder over the following days, not the hot, immediate rage that had first hit him at the sight of Elena Voss's name, but the specific patient calculation of a man who'd spent 15 years learning that the most devastating retaliation was always the one built on complete information. He needed to understand exactly what he was standing in front of before he moved against it. Marcus's investigation deepened with methodical precision, uncovering the full architecture of Elena's operation piece by piece, not simple abduction, a sophisticated, sustained system of leverage. Marisol held captive for 11 years as insurance against exactly the kind of retaliation Vincent's organization would have unleashed the moment he learned the truth. Elena had built an entire empire on the specific assumption that Vincent would never find out. Meanwhile, Marisol's trust in Vincent built achingly, painfully slowly. Priya's sessions continued daily, patient and unhurried, creating small openings where genuine connection occasionally broke through 11 years of learned fear. One afternoon, sitting in the same room where she'd first met with Priya, Marisol mentioned a specific childhood memory unprompted, the summer their mother taught them both to swim in a lake 2 hours outside the city, the way Vincent had held her afloat by the back of her swimsuit until she stopped being afraid of the water. Vincent, sitting quietly at the edge of the room where Priya had suggested he simply be present without pushing for anything, felt something in his chest crack open at the memory. You hated putting your face in the water. His voice stayed careful, quiet. You screamed every single time until Mum finally gave up trying to teach you to dunk your head. Something shifted in Marisol's expression, not quite a smile, but close enough that Vincent's breath caught in his throat. I still hate it. It was the first genuine exchange between them since she'd arrived, small and fragile, but real in a way none of his desperate questions during that first devastating hour had managed to be. He learned, slowly, to sit with her in silence rather than filling every quiet moment with the questions still burning in his chest. He learned to let her set the pace entirely, understanding with the specific patience 15 years of empire building had never once required of him that rebuilding trust with his sister demanded a completely different kind of control than anything he'd ever mastered. Elena Voss, meanwhile, had her own growing awareness that her captive had escaped. Her network reported Marisol's disappearance within hours of it happening, and her calculations shifted immediately from asset management to threat containment. 11 years of careful, patient control had just been undone by a single moment of chaos she hadn't fully anticipated, and the specific, cold clarity of her assessment left no room for sentiment. Marisol was no longer an asset worth protecting. She was now the single greatest threat to an operation Elena had spent over a decade building. Elena began moving assets and personnel with the specific urgency of someone who understood exactly how much damage a surviving witness could do if she reached the right ears with the right information. Marcus caught the first signs of that movement 3 days later, cross-referencing financial records that didn't match Elena's usual patterns, unusual transfers, a specific spike in security personnel activity near locations connected to her network that suggested preparation for something imminent, rather than the defensive posture of an organization simply protecting its existing operations. He's mobilizing. Marcus's voice carried the specific tension of a man watching pieces move faster than expected on a board he'd only recently learned existed. This isn't containment anymore. This is preparation for an offensive move. Vincent's jaw tightened at the update, his mind already running through the specific defensive architecture his organization would need to build in response. Late one night, in the quiet aftermath of another gentle session with Priya, Marisol found Vincent alone in his study, staring at a wall of documents Marcus had assembled tracing Elena's network. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. There was a man. Her voice came out quiet, careful, testing the weight of the memory before committing fully to sharing it. During my last few weeks, he transported me between locations a few times. I only saw his face clearly once. Vincent turned from the wall of documents, giving her his complete, careful attention without moving toward her. "Take your time." I recognized him. Marisol's hands twisted together in front of her, the specific physical tell of someone working through something that cost her considerably to say out loud. "Not from before, not from anything 11 years ago. I've seen him since I've been here, in this house, in a business setting, I think, the way he was dressed, the way he carried himself. He wasn't one of the men holding me. He seemed like someone with legitimate access to wherever he was." The room went completely still. Vincent's mind raced through every visitor, every associate, every trusted face that had passed through his organization's orbit over the past several years, searching for a specific match to the fragmented description Marisol was struggling to articulate. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Her voice steadied, carrying the same specific, unshakable resolve that had gotten her out of captivity in the first place. "I spent 11 years learning to remember faces exactly once, because sometimes that was the only warning I got before something changed." Vincent's blood went cold. If Marisol had seen this man in a legitimate business setting connected to Vincent's own organization, Elena's network wasn't simply adjacent to his empire, doing peripheral business at arm's length through shell corporations and distant transactions. It was embedded directly inside it. Someone Vincent trusted, someone with legitimate access to his own operations, his own house, his own inner circle, had direct, ongoing connections to the woman who'd stolen 11 years of his sister's life. And Vincent Calloway had absolutely no idea yet exactly how deep that betrayal actually ran, or how many more faces in his own trusted circle might belong to the same devastating conspiracy he'd been standing beside without ever once suspecting it. The purge began at dawn. Marcus led it with the specific, meticulous precision that had made him invaluable for over a decade, cross-referencing every trusted associate's movements, financial records, and known connections against the fragmented description Marisol had provided, narrowing a list of possibilities down through methodical elimination rather than paranoid guesswork. The betrayal, when it surfaced, cut exactly as deep as Vincent had feared. A logistics coordinator who'd worked inside Vincent's organization for 6 years, someone with legitimate, unquestioned access to shipment schedules and property movements, someone Vincent had personally vouched for at 2 separate gatherings, where Elena's peripheral network had also been present. He hadn't known about Marisol specifically, but he'd known enough. Irregular shipments that never quite matched their paperwork, a specific pattern of access requests to properties Vincent's organization maintained but rarely used, questions he should have asked, and chose instead to ignore because asking questions about Elena's business had never once seemed worth the trouble. Complicit through willful ignorance rather than direct participation, but complicit all the same. Vincent's fury at the discovery tempered itself against something more useful. Marisol's own growing agency in the investigation, no longer purely the traumatized survivor being carefully protected in a locked room, but an active participant whose 11 years of forced proximity to Elena's operation had given her exactly the kind of intelligence Vincent's people desperately needed. She sat with Marcus for hours, identifying faces from photographs, describing patterns of movement and scheduling she'd absorbed unconsciously across a decade of captivity, mapping details about Elena's operational structure that no outside surveillance could ever have gathered. "I want to be part of ending this." Her voice carried the same specific, unshakable resolve that had gotten her out of captivity in the first place. Not hidden away while everyone else fights a war that exists because of what was done to me. Vincent didn't argue. He'd learned enough in the past weeks to understand that protecting Marisol by removing her agency entirely was its own kind of cage, and he refused to be the one who built her another. Elena Voss made her final move 8 days later. Coordinated strike aimed directly at the estate itself. Timed for a night, Elena calculated Vincent's organization would still be too internally focused on rooting out its own compromised members to mount an effective defense. She was wrong. Vincent's organization, purged and refocused, met her forces with the specific, devastating precision of a man who'd spent 15 years building exactly this kind of capability. Marcus coordinated the defense from the estate's security center, directing personnel with the meticulous competence that had made him indispensable for over a decade, closing off every approach Elena's people attempted with methodical, controlled efficiency. The fighting reached the estate's interior within 20 minutes. Marisol, positioned in a secured room with 2 guards Vincent had personally selected, refused to remain purely passive even then. 11 years of captivity had taught her Elena's operational patterns with an intimacy no outside intelligence could match. She recognized the specific sequence of a breach attempt on the West Corridor before the guards' own radios confirmed it, calling out a warning that gave Vincent's people the exact seconds needed to reposition before Elena's forces broke through. She became an active asset in her own rescue, rather than simply its object, exactly as she'd insisted she would be. Elena Voss reached the estate's main hall herself, 20 minutes into the assault, flanked by the last of her personal security detail, her cold calculation finally colliding with the full weight of everything Vincent had built to protect what mattered to him. 11 years. Vincent's voice carried none of the desperate brokenness from that first devastating night. This was something colder, more absolute. 15 years of controlled fury finally given a target worthy of everything it had built toward. You stole 11 years of my sister's life and used my own trust in your network against me the entire time. Elena's composure held for exactly as long as it took her to understand her final gambit had already failed completely. You were never supposed to find her. Her voice carried genuine cold surprise rather than fear. The insurance was supposed to last indefinitely. It ran out the moment she got free. The confrontation that followed was brutal and final, carrying the full weight of everything the story had built toward. Vincent's controlled fury meeting Elena's collapsing operation with the specific, devastating precision that ended her network permanently and closed a conspiracy that had stolen over a decade of Marisol's life. By the time the estate fell silent again, Elena Voss's operation existed only in the documentation Marcus had spent weeks assembling, ready now to unravel every remaining piece of her network through channels that would ensure nothing like this ever operated again. Weeks passed. Marisol's recovery continued under Priya's careful, continued guidance, small moments of genuine progress accumulating slowly into something that finally started to resemble the sister Vincent remembered. Not a restoration of who she'd been at 17, but someone rebuilt entirely new on top of 11 devastating years. Someone whose specific quiet strength Vincent found himself in genuine awe of, rather than simply protective toward. Vincent's own reckoning unfolded more slowly, more privately. 15 years of empire building, all of it constructed on the specific promise that he would never again be powerless to protect what mattered, had in its own way kept him isolated from genuine connection for over a decade. The ruthless control that made him one of the most feared names on the eastern seaboard had also built walls around every relationship in his life, Marcus included, that he'd never once questioned until watching his sister slowly learn to trust him again forced him to examine exactly what that control had cost him. He began, tentatively, deliberately, letting Marcus and the people closest to him see more of the man beneath the dawn than he'd allowed anyone to witness since burying that empty casket 11 years earlier. Months into her recovery, on an ordinary afternoon that carried none of the urgency of everything that had come before it, Marisol asked Vincent to take her to the grave marker that had stood empty for 11 years. They stood together at the headstone in silence for a long time, the specific, devastating catharsis of finally being able to leave behind a lie, that had shaped both their lives so completely. It says I died at 17. Marisol's voice carried something steady now, something that hadn't been there in those first terrified weeks. I'm not that person anymore, but I'm also not dead. I don't know what to do with a grave that was never actually mine. Vincent stood beside her, looking at the headstone that had marked the worst day of his life for over a decade. We could leave it. His voice stayed quiet, thoughtful, not because it's true, but because it marks the exact moment everything changed, for both of us. And maybe that's worth remembering, even if the person it claims to hold never actually died at all. Marisol reached for his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since the night she'd arrived, small and tentative but entirely her own choice. Vincent held it carefully, the specific, quiet weight of 11 years, finally settling into something that felt, for the first time since that devastating night in his foyer, like genuine peace rather than unresolved grief. They stood together at a grave that had always been a lie, finally able to leave it behind, because the person it claimed to hold was standing very much alive beside the brother who never stopped searching for her, even during the 11 years he didn't know he was still looking. If this story broke something open in you, if it reminded you that even the most powerful people carry grief that shapes everything they build, subscribe right now because we are not finished. Share this with someone who needs a story about survival and reunion today. Like this video, drop your city below, and turn on notifications because the next story is already loaded and you are not ready for what's coming.